So, one of the most discussed and anticipated movies of the whole year has just been released, and I've just seen it, and I'm now going to talk about it. Kind of feel like I'm treading on thin ice on this one. Just to make it clear before I begin, this is not a rant video about the various fan discussions and controversies that have come about in this movie's wake. I don't want to offend anybody here, I just want to give my opinion. If you want more of what I just described, go and watch Doug Walker's review of the movie, because he does definitely go into his own personal feelings about the various controversies about the movie. So if that's what you want to see, go and watch his video. If you just want to find out what I think about the movie, then stick around. This is going to be a very quick video as well, because I do need to get back to working on Farming Wood reviews. I just thought I'd make something to help fill the gap between that and what I've just done. So this is going to be very quick, very unrehearsed, and something that admittedly I might change my opinions on in the future, but this is just something that I thought about the new Ghostbusters movie, and if you agree with me, great. If you don't agree with me, that's great too, but just thought you guys might want to know what I think about it. Speaking in the past here, I am actually quite a big fan of both Ghostbusters movies. I saw them when I was around about 12 years old, and admittedly it was one of those movies that grew on me more as I watched it. When I was actually growing up, I actually preferred the second one more, which I get the feeling that's probably going to garner more hate from this video than even just talking about the new Ghostbusters movie, but I've grown to appreciate both of them. I think I do now prefer the first one more than I do the second one, but I think that they're both very, very strong comedies that incorporate elements of sci-fi and even little bits of horror into there. They've got really likable characters. It's a very, very unique story, and even though it's somewhat cheap in some areas, you can see that the amount of effort and passion that went into these movies, and you can see how much the people who made them, from the actors, the writers, the directors, the producers, the set designers, the special effects artists, you can tell how much they enjoyed working on the movie and how much that they just really wanted to get across how much they loved working on it. So that's just my very quick thoughts on the original Ghostbusters movie. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's actually get into the new movie. First off, with the main characters, they're not all that bad, actually. I think I wouldn't put them quite on the same pedigree with Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, and Ernie Hudson, or even Sigourney Weaver, Annie Potts, and Rick Moranis' characters, but they do a good job with the characters they're given, and they're not quite exact cookie-cutter versions of the original. Admittedly, Melissa McCarthy's character is very similar to Dan Aykroyd's character of Ray in the original Ghostbusters, and there's also a little bit of Egon, Harold Ramis' character, in Kristen Wiig, but they do have their own flair to them, though I have to admit I do feel that Kristen Wiig was a bit wasted in this movie. She wasn't really given that much to do, despite the fact that she's the main character of the movie. She just kind of feels like she's constantly stumbling around, not really knowing what to do with herself, and there's a little bit of that in Melissa McCarthy's performance as well, but she also does a decent job, and there were times in the movie where when it was just her and Kristen Wiig, you can tell that which one of them was enjoying being there more so than the other one. So admittedly, Kristen Wiig and Melissa McCarthy weren't fantastic, but they did decent jobs, and the latter of which definitely looked like she was enjoying herself. Kate McKinnon and Leslie Jones, on the other hand, were actually really entertaining. I wouldn't say that they were straight up funny. Nothing that they did was 100% always good to make really good humour, at least in me, but they were actually really well played, and they had more of a defined character to them, which were very unique in terms of their actual characters. You could potentially compare Katie a little bit to Bill Murray, but Bill Murray was definitely more of a cynic, whereas she's a very overly enthusiastic in basically what she does, and almost a little bit psychotic in a way, and she is actually very entertaining, though admittedly there are a few scenes where she goes a bit too far with her character, but despite that, I did enjoy her, and Leslie Jones is actually, I'd say, probably the most original character. She's not 100% Ernie Hudson. Ernie was kind of like the observational straight man. He was kind of like playing the part of the audience, of just this guy who's very new to the whole paranormal element, looking into the world the way we do. She has a little bit of that in her as well, but the most element about her is how she's kind of like the brains of the more logical element of the whole thing. Like, she knows how to get around places, she knows how to get things, and she has the most knowledge about the areas in which they're actually, you know, doing their ghost busting. Plus, she also made me laugh quite a few times too. I actually think that she's probably my favourite character in the movie. So, in terms of the main characters, they weren't fantastic. They're not quite the comic legends or great comedic characters that the originals were, but they definitely did a good job, and they were nice to see. As for the supporting cast, there's really only two major supporting players, which, to be fair, that's basically what it was back in the original movie. We get Chris Hemsworth, who, basically the best way I can put it is that he's playing the dumb blonde. Or rather, the dumb hipster blonde. He doesn't do a very good job, admittedly, and despite the fact that he looks like he's trying his best, and he looks like he's having a bit of a good time, not a lot of the stuff that he says is very funny. He gets interesting at the end, which I won't go into too much about why, because I will try to avoid spoilers as much as possible to anyone who hasn't seen the movie yet and wants to go in blind. But there are some bits during the climax where he does become interesting, though that's partly because he's technically playing a different character, but again, I won't go into too much detail. And then we have Neil Casey, who is playing the villain in this regard, and I'm going to be perfectly honest, he was completely and utterly pathetic. He wasn't useless as a villain, but he was really pathetic in actually playing a villain, and he wasn't really that interesting. He's slightly intriguing in the concept in that he's the first major human villain that the Ghostbusters has faced, because let's not forget that in the first movie there was Gozer and her dogs, and in the second movie there was Vigo and the guy that Peter McNichol was playing, which I actually think that Neil Casey is trying to do kind of a mimic of his character, because he's got a bit of a similar air to him, but much less creepy than Peter McNichol was, which I think is where it kind of falls down. The idea is that he's kind of playing a misanthropic kind of all humanity is a complete waste of space and I need to start again. So he's a little bit also like Ivo Shandor as well, but we never really got to see Ivo except for in the 2009 video game, which I'll get back to in a minute. But yeah, again, much like Chris Hemsworth, he only really gets interesting in the end, but again, that's for reasons that I can't say without giving away spoilers. But yeah, so the main supporting cast in this movie are not particularly great. As for the centerfold of this movie, that comes down to the humour and the scares, and there are elements of both that do work in this movie and elements that don't. There are definitely signs to show that this is done like a modern comedy movie where the director got a bunch of funny people together, put them in the scenario, told them what the scene was going to be, but just said, go a little off script and we'll see what comes out of it and put it in the movie. And there are cases where that does work, particularly from Kate McKinnon and Leslie Jones, and a little bit from Melissa McCarthy, but she, Kristen Wiig and Chris Hemsworth clearly need a bit more direction in how to told how to be funny, and there are also a lot more immature jokes. Like, if you watch the original Ghostbusters, you can tell that they kept things very intelligent and they always kept the audience guessing on what was going to happen. Here, they go a little bit more for the easy punchline, so when a scene opens, you can kind of tell what the main joke, or sometimes even what the main scare is going to be, and that ends up happening so much that by halfway through the movie, if you're able to kind of put the pieces together, you can almost kind of predict where the movie is going to go in general, which is really unfortunate because Ghostbusters was always a movie to keep you guessing, and the second one, while it was a bit more predictable, it still had some interesting elements that kept you always thinking about what was going to happen next. This movie, it just feels a bit too predictable, and in some cases, to get a more general audience, that can be a good thing, but I always prefer movies that try and stay intelligent and make you want to try and keep thinking along with it, so that is a bit disappointing. But even so, there are a couple of jokes that still do work in this movie, mostly again from Kate McKinnon and Leslie Jones, because they do a fantastic job with their parts. And in terms of the scares, there are actually quite a few moments in this movie that do have a legitimate sense of atmosphere. And even though the actual scare elements do come from a lot of, again, modern elements with jump scares, there are a couple of moments where they do have some atmosphere to them and have some memorable visuals, particularly again near the very end, where it probably has the biggest sense of apocalypse that the Ghostbusters has ever had, even though this movie's not actually in canon with the other two movies, which is a bit confusing at first, but it does kind of create its own identity as its own film in the end, but it does make it all confusing, particularly when the original actors playing different characters start popping up into it, which I'll just get into in a minute. So yeah, the main element of this movie can work, but there are some elements where it doesn't quite work as well as the original movie. So I feel that if you have kind of a blind element and you haven't seen the other Ghostbusters movies, or that you're not too obsessed with them being like the original Ghostbusters movies, you probably actually would like this movie. But if you're really, really into this being like the old Ghostbusters movies and you really hold on to those movies with a passion, you're probably not going to like this movie. So I'd say as an overall, this is actually not a bad movie whatsoever, and there's actually quite a few elements in this that make it really do stand out, but the fact that it's called Ghostbusters makes it fall down quite a bit. This would actually probably be a fantastic standalone horror comedy if it had a different name and obviously changed some of the elements around for copyright's sake. But the fact that it's called Ghostbusters makes us constantly think of the old ones, and that just brings this movie down, unfortunately, and is also what has been causing most of the controversy to begin with. So if this was called something different, I think that this would actually probably been one of the most popular movies of the year, but unfortunately, it's just kind of a subpar Ghostbusters movie, but there are still some elements in it that are actually quite well done, so I would say that this movie's probably not as bad as some people are making it out to be, but it's certainly no masterpiece. And considering that when I saw this movie, I saw trailers for films like Bad Mums and Mike and Dave, there are definitely worse comedies out there, to be sure. Now for my little miscellaneous bits and little nitpicky things that I just like to talk about that I thought were either good or bad. For one thing, the editing could have been a lot better. Like I said, there are lots of scenes where there's just dead space without a lot of stuff happening, and there are some cases when a scene ends either really abruptly or feeling like there should have been more to it, but it just cuts to something else. And in some cases there are bits where they cut to stuff that make you feel like why they were even in there in the first place. So I definitely think that there could have been some tighter editing in this movie, but it's definitely not the worst editing I've ever seen in a major motion picture, so it could have been worse. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of the older Ghostbusters cast members in this movie playing new characters, with the exception of Harold Ramis because of his unfortunate passing a few years ago, and Rick Moranis because he's currently retired from acting. But what's really confusing about it is that near the beginning, during one of the more goofier jokes of the film, there's a bit where Melissa McCarthy is talking to Kristen Wiig about a woman who's got a ghost in her basement, and she says she doesn't know where to go, she can't go anywhere else, none of her friends will believe her, who are you going to call? And then in the background a TV plays something called The Ghostbusters, which is in black and white for some reason. Now when I saw that, I figured that that's what the old Ghostbusters actors were going to be. They were going to be whatever this fictional TV show is, and that was going to be their roles, because they don't really show anything of it. It's just a show happened to be called The Ghostbusters, which is also in black and white, which does make me think if they're trying to play reference to The Ghost Space Busters, which was the original show that had the name, which Columbia TriStar had to pay rights for in order to make the original Ghostbusters movie. But no, it's just a really out of nowhere joke. The other actors do make appearances throughout the movie. Bill Murray probably makes the most appearances and is the one who interacts with the newer crew the most, where he's basically playing Walter Peck from the original movie, which, to be fair, he does it well in his own way, but it really is disappointing to see Bill Murray, who can do so much more in terms of his comedic talent, just basically be reduced to one punchline characters. Dan Aykroyd appears, who probably has the best line in the movie, in that he actually talks about the ghost as Class 5 roaming vapours, which is what they classified Slimer as in the original movie, so it was good to see him, even though he was only in it for a brief moment. Ernie Hudson appears at the very last minute as Leslie Jones's uncle, who they borrowed the hearse from in the first place to make Ecto-1, and he has a couple of good lines, and he's actually looking pretty good for his age. Sigourney Weaver also pops up during the credits sequence as Katie McKinnon's mentor. She kind of has a feeling where, like in most of her comic performances of the last couple of years, she just kind of shows up for a paycheck, but it's nice to see her either way. And probably one of my favourite cameos in the movie, from one of my favourite minor characters in Ghostbusters, Annie Potts shows up as the receptionist for the hotel which the villain works at, and she basically does a repeat of her Janine shtick from the original Ghostbusters movie, which is actually a really good thing to see. And now, just before I go, it's time to talk about the effects and the music. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the amount of CGI that's been used in the movie, and none of it looks particularly convincing in the actual trailers. And yes, admittedly the CGI, it's not fantastic, and it is really disappointing because there's barely any practical effects used. But I will say that the actual subpar CGI actually does work in a couple of areas and looking very creepy. For example, there's a scene where the Ghostbusters go to a music hall and try to basically get rid of a ghost that looks like Satan, but before he pops out, he possesses one of the backstage mannequins, and because it's this very, very kind of subpar CGI and it has a bit of a stiff motion to it, it actually makes the walking mannequin look really, really creepy. And some of the CGI during the climax is actually actually really good, particularly during the main baddie ghost, who I won't say who he is, but you can tell that they put a lot of effort into those effects. Though it is also a shame to see Slimer in what is admittedly not one of his most flattering appearances, but I still think it looks better than he did in Ghostbusters 2. And then as for the music, there's a lot of modern music in this, and not a lot of it is fantastic. There are a couple of older songs in this that I actually did like, but this is mostly a kind of soundtrack that's made for the younger audience, which I won't really complain too much because it's more or less who the movie was aimed for, but it does seem a shame that they have a lot of songs that will be pretty dated by the time this movie's about 5 or 10 years old. But there are 5 remixes of the original Ghostbusters theme, and 3 of them play in the credits, and most of them are actually really good, and there's one really good remix of the orchestral version during the climax that really gets the blood pumping. But the very first time you hear it, it's this terrible... I don't really know how to even describe it, but it's just an awful, awful remix, and it just sounds terrible, and it's barely recognisable as the Ghostbusters theme. But despite that, most of the Ghostbuster theme versions in this movie are actually pretty good, and for a lack of a better term, both that and some of the elements that come into this movie do make it feel like a Ghostbusters movie. But like I said, that's also part of the problem, and I think why this movie isn't going to be particularly popular among a lot of people. But as a final word, I'd say that if you thought this movie looked a little bit intriguing, and either you're rather new to the Ghostbusters franchise or you're just okay to see something that's a little bit new from the franchise, then I definitely suggest checking this out. But if you're really, 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 really attached to the old franchise, don't go see this movie. In fact, I'd say that if you're really into seeing a proper Ghostbusters 3, watch the cutscene from the Ghostbusters 2009 video game, because not only is the plot actually very similar to this movie, which makes me think that they might have actually stolen a couple of elements from the video game, but the fact that the original cast is in it, Harold Ramis included because it was before he passed away, it actually does feel like that missing Ghostbusters sequel that we never got. So if you really do want to see a proper Ghostbusters 3, just go and watch that. I'm sure that there's a compilation of it on YouTube somewhere. People are always into doing that. But as for Ghostbusters, it definitely wasn't a fantastic movie, but it was actually quite entertaining for what it was. But I don't think I'd see it many more times again, because I think it would probably grate on me the more times I see it. But time to get back to Farthingwood now, so I hope you enjoyed my opinions, and if you don't, please don't crucify me.